Hey folks, it's Ben. I've got another video for you. We're going to be changing a wheel bearing on a 1999 Chevrolet S-10. First thing we need to do is loosen the bolts on this wheel. We have to disconnect the battery. Because I run an aftermarket wheel, the holes for the lug nuts are actually quite a bit smaller than the traditional S10 truck, so I actually have to use a 3/4 inch ratchet and actually break these ahead of time. Now I did have this wheel off earlier this week, so it's not going to be too tight. But let's break these before we actually lift up the front of the vehicle. Because we are dealing with a little bit of electronics, we do have an ABS connector on the front bearing. We're going to need to disconnect the battery just for safety's sake. Okay, I've got the vehicle jacked up. We're on the front cross member there. I jacked it up and then put the jack stands on it. The vehicle is in park, and I also blocked up the rear wheel. There are actually only 6 bolts we need to undo. We have one right here on the brake caliper. There's another one down here that holds the brake caliper on, so we can move that out of the way. We actually have a shaft on the, or a nut on the axle shaft that we're actually going to need to undo and push the shaft in a little bit. And then the bearing itself, and it's kind of hidden. The only thing we can see is the outer ring right here and all the 5 studs that come out. It has 3 bolts, and they're all 18 millimeters, so we'll be pretty easy getting those out. These have been off before. I did a brake job on this truck not too many years ago, maybe 2. The rotor really wants to come off with it. Off you come. There we go. So we've got the caliper hung to the side. Sometimes this rotor is hard to come off because it will bond to the bearing. Let me adjust the camera a little bit here. You can lightly tap it with a hammer to try to get it off. However, this one just wants to come off. Here we have the culprit. This is our bearing assembly. One of the reasons why I didn't change this one first is it still actually looks pretty clean. But apparently, of course, the ABS sensor's gone, so we got to replace that the bearing anyway. But this is the guy we're going to come out. There are 3 bolts that hold it on. They're 18 millimeter. There's 1 on top and 2 on the sides here. And those are going to be the next bolts we take off after we undo the axle nut here. So I'm going to straighten out the wheel and show you how I do that. Of course, we were going to use an impact socket. This is a 36 millimeter. Fits right on there. We're going to use our Craftsman impact wrench in the right direction. And with any luck, this will go. Now sometimes you got to let the PB blaster hit this thing for a little bit, but we're going in the right direction. We've got our full torque. Let's see if we get any business done here. Okay, that came off way too easy. There's also a washer that's here. So we have the nut washer assembly. Now this shaft is free to move in and out of this bearing now that we've removed the nut. The nut actually pulls the shaft against the bearing and everything's happy. So now that that nut's out, it actually helps when we're changing the bearing to actually free up this shaft first to make sure that we've got some play. That way when we release the bearing, we can just pull it right off. We don't have to actually fight it. To do that, we're going to use a gear puller. And with that, the shaft is slowly moving in the bearing. I'm going to push it in a good ways, and now it's really free. So now our shaft isn't keeping against our bearing. We're going to use our 18 millimeter wrench and just use the easiest ones first. There's no real particular order you need to undo these for. Hopefully it's not going to give us any troubles as we try to break these free. Ah, yes. There's one free. It's relatively loose. Let's try the top one up here. It's very hard to get a socket on this top one. In fact, you can't. So you pretty much have to wrench this one all the way. This one's a toughie. There. Okay, so I've gotten all 3 bolts out of it. Nothing is holding this bearing on except the friction of it being against the spindle. So, as my girlfriend would say, percussive maintenance or something like that, we're going to beat it off. And there we go. Yeah, I've definitely been in here before. That's all anti-seize. So that's it. This is our bearing. This plate actually should come off. We'll work it off, and we'll start reassembly once we start cleaning up this spindle. We got a lot of rust in here and dirt we'll want to get out. Well, there's one thing I actually forgot to do because of our broken ABS wire, but you actually have to disconnect the wire first before you can actually get the bearing off the truck. Now, our wires here, there are actually 2 mounting points for it. There's usually one right up here, and it's a 10mm bolt. So you can actually just stick a socket on that and undo it, and you'll get a new one of these plates, so you don't have to worry about that. It travels up into right over here where the brake line connects, and that is a 13mm bolt, and you need to keep this steel bracket, and I'll show you on the bench exactly what it looks like, but we got to undo that bolt, and so we can get this little wire free, and then it actually plugs right underneath the frame rail. Here's our failed bearing, and it has failed. I mean, just turning it, it's very free turning, which is reasonably fair, but it's very loud turning too. There's definitely corrosion inside the bearings there. So this is our loud bearing for sure. Just like so. Then we're going to slide up on the shaft, which has been cleaned. I didn't really have to put much anti-seize on it because it already kind of had some from before. And we're kind of wiggle it in as best we can, and we might need to put our nut on and actually pull it in the right way, and it is. It's just kind of pull the shaft in to give us some more space for our bearing to fit in and get our bearing surface to sit in there. We're against the knuckle. So now what we need to do is start our bolts. So after several minutes of slowly bolting this thing on, we now have equal tightness approximately on all these bolts. Now, as we tighten this, it'll turn the whole bearing assembly again. So what we need to do is, we like these threads, we need to keep them. So you want to go ahead and put on 2 lug nuts already. Take our ratchet and complete bringing in the shaft through the bearing. When do you know you're done? It will stop. You can take a flashlight or a light and look in the back here. And I had a flashlight around here, but I'll use my shop light here. Take a look at the back and see that your shaft is actually seated against the bearing, and you're good. There's an actual torque for this. You can get a wrench and do it, but tight is good. Our first wire connection is right here, and it actually sits just like that. It has to. It's the way the bracket is. Next one here is, we actually had to put this back on the wire from the original part of the vehicle, and it actually, there's a hole in the frame right there, and it holds the brake line and this ABS line. You put the nut through that, put the nut through that. There's a little clip right there to keep it from turning. So you push all that back in. You start your bolt, and you'll have to use a wrench because you can't get a socket because of the way the brake line is placed. Next, we take our plug. We plug it into our connector here for the ABS system. It should snap in like so. It's got a little rubber base on the bottom of it, and there's a hole in the frame right there that it should snap into. Okay, painted that. Got a little bit on the wheel studs as well. Put our rotor back on. And next we follow by the brake caliper. So we'll release it from its coat hanger spline. Get her to slide back on the rotor. It didn't want to leave. You should be able to kind of walk it on a little bit. If you can't, then you can always just get one bolt started on top and then kind of sling it down. If I can get that bolt in, then I can. Make these nice and snug. They like to be tight. They're holding the brakes onto your truck, so obviously you want to keep them there.